In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front became a place where human beings stopped counting days and started counting survival. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, Nazi Germany desperately needed a victory, something powerful enough to prove the war was still winnable, and something dramatic enough to restore confidence inside the Wehrmacht and inside Hitler's shrinking circle of believers. The answer was Operation Citadel. The target was Kursk, a massive bulge in the front line that pushed westward like a fist in the map. For the Germans, it was an invitation. If they could strike the bulge from north and south, encircle the Soviet forces inside it, and destroy them, they could regain the initiative and force the Red Army back onto the defensive. But Kursk was not a surprise. The Soviets knew it was coming. For months, Soviet engineers and infantry transformed the Kursk region into one of the most heavily prepared defensive zones in military history. It wasn't one trench line. It was a system, layered belts of mines, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, artillery positions, camouflaged strongpoints, and fallback lines built to absorb shock and punish movement. In many areas, Soviet defensive depth stretched for miles. The German army arrived with some of its most powerful units, including elite panzer divisions and heavy armor meant to punch through the Soviet lines. Many German soldiers believed this would be the return of Blitzkrieg, the kind of rapid victory they had once taken for granted. But by 1943, the war had changed. German units were experienced, but tired. Fuel shortages, stretched logistics, and years of attrition had weakened their margin for error. Replacements often lacked training. Veteran officers carried the memory of earlier defeats, and in private, many doubted that any single offensive could solve the larger strategic disaster Germany faced. Still, the orders came. Attack, break through, move fast, and on the ground speed came with a price, because the Kursk battlefield wasn't just fortified by men, it was fortified by terrain. The plains were broken by trenches, shell craters, collapsed earthworks, anti-tank ditches, abandoned dugouts, and countless invisible obstacles that made movement dangerous even in daylight. In darkness, it could become deadly. German units tried to move at night to avoid Soviet observation and artillery. Night movement was part of German doctrine, meant to preserve surprise and reduce exposure. But night movement during Kursk did not look like clean planning on a map. It looked like confusion. Columns that separated. Units that lost their direction. Men stepping into trenches they didn't know existed. Vehicles bogging down in mud or striking mines planted in depth. Messages failing to reach the right officers. The Soviet defensive belts were not simple lines. They were layers, often overlapping. In some sectors the trench systems were so dense that even Soviet troops could become disoriented moving through them under fire. And the weather made everything worse. Summer rain had turned soil into heavy, sticky clay. The ground could swallow boots, tires, and tracks. Trenches filled with water, walls softened. Dugouts that were safe on one day could become unstable after hours of bombardment. For the average infantryman, the battlefield wasn't just an enemy in front of him, it was the earth itself. As the fighting began, artillery fire shook the land constantly. Not a single barrage, but a continuous vibration. Soviet guns, German guns, mortars, rockets, tank rounds, and mines detonating across the landscape. This kind of bombardment does something to a battlefield that maps cannot capture. It churns the surface. It collapses structures. It crushes trenches into shallow scars. It turns prepared positions into broken pits. And in the middle of this, men still had orders to move, to press forward, to keep the offensive alive. There were moments during Kursk where soldiers died in ways that were never neatly recorded. Men buried by collapsing trench walls, trapped in damaged dugouts, pinned in shell holes that filled with loose earth or water, or simply lost in the darkness and never found again. Not because the earth swallowed armies, but because the scale of destruction and the chaos of movement made certain deaths unrecoverable. And in a battle where millions of men were fighting, The line between missing, dead, and unrecoverable could blur into a single word written on a report. Missing. It's important to understand how battlefield disappearance really happens. In large-scale war, soldiers don't always vanish through mystery. They vanish through destruction. A trench collapses, a dugout is hit, a minefield explodes, a vehicle burns, a man is thrown into a crater and buried by dirt and debris. A unit retreats under fire, leaving the dead behind. The landscape changes so violently that recovery becomes impossible. And Kursk was exactly that kind of war. The most famous part of Kursk is the armored clash. Steel on steel, tanks firing at close range, the roar of engines, and the shock of explosions. But underneath that famous story was the infantry battle that never ends. Men digging, men crawling, men listening for mines, men trapped under artillery fire for hours, men moving through trench networks under darkness, fear, and exhaustion. German infantry were often forced into Soviet defensive belts they didn't fully understand. Soviet engineers had built obstacles not just to stop tanks, but to shape movement, to funnel attackers into killing zones. The Germans knew Soviet defenses were extensive, but even they were shocked by the depth. Every breakthrough revealed another belt. Every advance ran into mines. Every attempt to maneuver was met by artillery. And the deeper the Germans pushed, the heavier the pressure became. The environment itself became a weapon. Trenches that seemed like protection could become traps when bombardment intensified. Dugouts that offered shelter could become graves. If an artillery round collapsed the entrance, mine explosions could bury men under soil, even when they survived the blast. And because Kursk was a battle of constant movement under fire, the time to rescue trapped men was often not available. A soldier buried by collapse might still be alive for minutes. But in that moment, the unit might be under orders to move or pinned down by fire. Digging could expose more men to artillery. Stopping could break momentum. And in a war built on discipline, hesitation could feel like disobedience. Some men were rescued. Others were not. That is the cruel reality of battlefield math. As the German offensive slowed, the war became heavier. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Soviet reserves arrived in waves. German armor ran into mined terrain and anti-tank guns positioned with precision. German air support could not dominate the skies. Soviet aircraft began to appear in greater numbers. The Germans were still powerful, still dangerous, still capable of inflicting enormous losses. But Kursk showed something terrifying. They could no longer win decisive victories. The offensive did not collapse in a single moment. It wore out. Like a machine running without oil, it ground itself down. By mid-July, German commanders understood what was happening. Their panzer units were suffering. Their infantry were exhausted. They were spending strength they could not replace for ground that did not lead to strategic victory. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not simply defending. They were preparing to counterattack. In the German ranks, something began to spread that was more dangerous than simple fear. It was dread. Not just fear of the Red Army, but fear of the battlefield itself. Men began to talk about places where trenches were unstable, where dugouts had collapsed, where entire areas seemed cursed by mines and artillery. War creates myths quickly. In combat, rumors grow into warnings, and warnings grow into beliefs that shape behavior. Soldiers who had survived years of fighting began to refuse certain shelters. They preferred open ground to trenches that might trap them. They slept lightly, listening not only for enemy movement, but for the shifting soil above them. Some of this was practical. Some of it was psychological damage. But all of it showed how Kursk was breaking men, not only with Soviet firepower, but with exhaustion and uncertainty. And this is the part many history documentaries miss. Kursk was not just a battle of tanks. It was a battle of engineering and endurance. The Soviet defense system did not win because it destroyed every German tank in one strike. It won because it slowed movement, drained momentum, and forced the Germans to pay a price for every mile until the offensive could no longer continue. Then the Soviets unleashed their own power. As German formations began to stall, Soviet counteroffensives struck. The Red Army's reserves, held back behind the defensive belts, moved forward. German units were forced into withdrawal, often under relentless pressure, and retreat on the Eastern Front was never clean. It was chaos. Wounded men left behind, vehicles abandoned, units split apart, roads jammed, artillery pounding retreat routes. It was during these phases, withdrawal and repositioning, that many soldiers became truly missing. Not because they disappeared in mystery, but because the battlefield was too large, the retreat too fast, and the death too violent for careful accounting. After the fighting, German recovery teams searched where they could. They examined destroyed lines and reopened trenches when possible. But in many areas, the soil had collapsed and hardened. Trenches were filled. Dugouts were crushed. Mines remained active. Even touching certain areas was dangerous. War did not allow time for perfect recovery. The reports were written quickly. Missing in action, unconfirmed, presumed dead. And for families at home, those words were torture. Not a death notice, not a burial, not a grave, just absence. For the Soviets, Kursk became a symbol of survival and strength, proof that the Red Army could absorb German power and then break it. The battle became part of the larger story of turning the tide. For Germany, it became a warning sign. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would lose initiative again and again. The Eastern Front would never return to the era of rapid offensives and confident victories. It would become a long retreat under pressure, bleeding the army until there was nothing left to defend Berlin. Today, Kursk is remembered in museums and textbooks as the greatest tank battle of the war. The enormous numbers, millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, endless artillery, make it easy to treat it like a gigantic chess match. But the truth is smaller and more human. Kursk was a battle of men dying in places no one would ever return to. Men crushed under collapsed earthworks, men lost in minefields, men burned in vehicles, men buried by artillery blasts and never recovered. Men listed as missing, not because they were unknown to their comrades, but because war made the body unrecoverable. And that is the real horror of industrial warfare. Sometimes death is dramatic. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes the battlefield doesn't just kill you, it removes you from the story. Fields get plowed, roads get built, villages are rebuilt, the land becomes peaceful again. But under the ground, the war remains. Even decades later, artifacts still rise to the surface after heavy rain, fragments of equipment, pieces of uniforms, rusted ammunition, occasionally human remains. Each discovery is a reminder of what Kursk truly was. Not just a turning point in strategy, but a place where the scale of war erased individual endings. And the final lesson is this: history often remembers the moments that can be photographed. Tanks charging, guns firing, leaders giving orders. But the most terrifying parts of war are sometimes the ones without witnesses. The moments where men are trapped, unheard, and unrecovered. The moments where the earth closes over the battlefield, and the record simply says one word missing. So if this story changed the way you think about Kursk and the Eastern Front, leave your thoughts in the comments. And for more true war stories, forgotten tragedies, and the realities behind famous battles, subscribe to the channel.